My name is Martin Hill. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar about how we can construct and talk about solutions to climate change. My name is Martin Kirk. I work for The Rules. I run the strategy for The Rules. You will also see here we have Joe Brewer, who does a lot of research and stuff for us. I'll let Joe introduce himself in a moment. We're waiting also to be joined by two people, Rajesh and Gopi from Greenpeace India. Rajesh was the head of the sustainable farming team at Greenpeace India. He's since moved on, but Gopi has taken his place, and they have a particular expertise in talking to and campaigning on issues of regenerative and sustainable agriculture. But we're hoping they're going to be able to join us any moment now. But Joe and I are going to kick off. Because we know everyone's short on time. So the main topic here is solutions, particularly solutions to climate change, and we're going to focus on one particular initiative that's underway, an area of policy right now that is getting a lot of attention and could be very much be seen as a solutions focused campaign. But we're also really conscious of the fact that we've seen time and time again in the past that if solutions are presented in a way that is not well considered, they can very easily be co-opted, and the language of the solutions, the language of the ideas, can be used to greenwash over things that are anything but solutions. So what we want to talk about today is how to think about, and how we'll use one example of how we've been thinking about this particular idea to see if we can head off at the construction phase of the campaign, greenwashing and co-option at a public level, and also poor policy or kind of false, what we would call false policy solutions at a policy level. So the idea that we're going to be talking about has been termed regenerative farming. Here we are. Here Rajesh has just joined us. Hi Rajesh, thank you so much for joining us. Joe and I are just about to kick off. We'll come to you after we've done a little bit of an introduction, and Joe has spelt out some of the considerations we've been having, and then we'll come to you for your reflections and your experience, if that's all right. So I was just introducing this idea that we at The Rules have been looking at, particularly, that is called being termed regenerative farming. I'm sure everybody knows that agriculture is directly responsible for directly responsible for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. But if you factor in processing and transport and packaging and the retail and waste, that figure goes up to about 30%. So agriculture is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas concentrations. And it does this. One of the key pillars, the key practices that is responsible for this is industrial farming, which is dangerous for three reasons. One, it destroys the ecosystem underground by using heavy till methods, by destroying the health and robustness of the soil. By using chemicals, it artificially applies nitrogen and phosphorus to the air, to the crops, which shuts down the demand that they naturally have for CO2. So where they would sequester CO2, the application of chemicals gets in the way of that process. And thirdly, because a lot of industrial agriculture is monoculture, nature's natural system of regeneration is blocked by the consistent planting of one crop and the withdrawal of the nutrients to feed that one crop. So what regenerative farming is, and it's a particular form of organic farming. And this is one of the key questions that's really interesting in this debate, how we automatically run into one terminological confusion between organic and regenerative, and where certainly all regenerative farming is organic, and not all organic farming is regenerative. It's a particular form of it. And at the heart of regenerative farming is the idea of no-till farming, which means that you don't go and turn the soil artificially. What you do is you rely on what they call cover crops to provide and regenerate the soil so that it works with nature's own processes. Now, a lot of studies have been done, and then increasing studies have been done. The biggest one was by a group called the Rodale Institute here in the US, who did a longitudinal 30-year study where they compared different types of farming, literally side by side, and they looked at yield, they looked at cost, they looked at the potential profit margins, they looked at the whole cycle of it, and they found that regenerative farming, although there was a drop in yields early on, the yields came back very quickly once the soil regenerated itself, and actually it was not only a sustainable from an ecological perspective, but it was also had all the elements of being a highly economically viable system as well. But there are big problems standing in the way of this being implicated. First of all, the biggest one being that the industrial agriculture system is huge and growing and has most of the political weight behind it. So anybody trying to put up regenerative farming as an idea is going to face opposition and an awful lot of just kind of cognitive barriers. And that's particularly what we're going to talk about today. So just to recap, so we're talking about solutions overall. We're particularly talking about how you construct, at the construction phase of a campaign, how you might head off the worst kind of greenwashing and co-option and poor policy solutions. I'm just going to finish with a quick quote from UNCTAD here, who say that in terms of the biggest barriers to putting in regenerative farming, they say the structural barrier is subsidies at a national level, but also in terms of dealing in the context of WTO. And he says, this is the author of a big report UNCTAD put out. We'll provide you with a link to that at the end. There must be more scrutiny of agricultural subsidies, including those that appear to promote environmentally sustainable farming, as there are ample opportunities for abuse and misuse. So that's the point that we're really going to be focusing on today. So I'm just you're gonna lose sight of my lovely green shirt now, and I'm going to put up a PowerPoint screen share, and I'm going to hand over to Joe to talk more about the detailing of how we're going to go about with this. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself and then just kick it off? And then after Joe, Rajesh will come to you for some comments and reflections.
Yes, happy to. Thanks so much for that introduction, Martin. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe Brewer, and I'm a cognitive linguist and complexity researcher who studies the evolution of discourse. So the work that I've been doing with the rules for over 2 years now is looking at the frame semantics, so looking at the construction of language and the power dynamics in the conversations about different policies to try to help clarify strategies for storytelling and strategies for framing the issues themselves so that our campaigns are more likely to be successful and kind of restructure the landscape of power by having some stories rise to dominance and other stories that have been dominant to fall from their central positions. And one of the places that I've had an interest for quite a long time now is looking at the discourse around climate change. And I actually have a master's degree in atmospheric science. So some of my early academic training was in what's called Earth system science. So global warming and climate change has always been an issue that a passion of mine. And one of the things that I think is relevant to the conversation today is just a brief comment about that discourse, that for most of the last few decades where people have talked about climate change, the majority of the conversation by environmental organizations has been trying to get people to care about the problem. And so this has been discussions about how greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere, how this is something that's going to impact human societies, that this is something that's caused by human activities. And there's been ongoing debate, and we could go into hours and hours of discussion about all of the ways that that's been stalled, intentionally spreading misinformation and confusion. But the main point that I want to make here is that for most of those last 3 decades, the conversation about global warming has been focused on the problem. By which I mean that people have been trying to get people to care about the problem or convincing people that there is a problem or describing how serious the problem is. And from a cognitive linguistics perspective, it turns out that this is a really big issue, because if we're talking about the problems, then we're talking about things that evoke fear, that create sense of loss for people, and that activate a lot of different emotions that really aren't helpful for spreading solutions. And that conversation about spreading solutions is a very different kind of conversation. So one of the things that I've been watching for a few years now has been whether or not the conversation has shifted into a solution space. And for the most part, until very recently, the conversation about global warming has not been in the solution space. But I've seen a few anecdotal indicators that suggest we may be moving into a conversation that's very different from what was before. And one of the things that's suggesting this is that there has been a growing acceptability that climate change is real after the last few years of lots of media coverage of major weather events and natural disasters that are making the idea that global warming is happening and is harmful is something that's getting harder and harder to deny for many people. But also recently, when we look at examples like Naomi Kleins' new book, This Changes Everything, which is currently quite popular. It's just come out in the last 6 weeks or so. One part of the website celebrating or promoting her book is called Beautiful Solutions, and it is basically a showcase of lots of different solutions to the climate crisis. And seeing this example of people who are trying to get people to take action on climate change and really highlighting the solutions is a new stage in the discourse on climate change. And it seems that we're just beginning to move into a time where people can talk a lot more about solutions and focus much less on the problems. And so in this space where the conversations about solutions are still somewhat early stage, I think it's very important for us as campaigners and as strategists to try to understand what the power plays are going to be used by our opposition, and how we can tell stories as powerfully as possible to frame the debate ahead of time, to kind of set the terms of the debate early, so that those who want to stall action on climate change and keep the neoliberal system that exists today in place, that they have to respond to our stories rather than making us respond to theirs. And this is where the conversation about how we talk, what language we use for regenerative farming is a nice, manageably small area of the larger solution space that we can talk about. And so, Martin, if you could jump to the next slide in the slide deck. For those of you who can see this, I know that sometimes Google Hangouts is not the best for making this front and center, but I hope that it is. We have a slide now that says Frame and Logical Foundations. And this is these are some insights that have come from a bit of preliminary work that I've done for the rules in the last few weeks. So I want to first say that we should not consider any of this analysis to be complete, comprehensive, or final. This is very much in the preliminary stage where these are more like discussion pieces. But one of the things that we observed right away was that there are several different ways of talking about agriculture. And this can create a lot of confusion for people. And so for us to get clear about what we're trying to advocate as solutions to climate change in the space of agriculture, that we want to have the conversation be about what is changing rather than how things are. Because if we just talk about how things are, like how agriculture is done or what farming is in some static sense, then we're not really enabling a conversation about what's changing. And that's why this first point says we need stories that talk about process, not just static concepts. That we're really wanting to describe the dynamic of how the world is changing and how agricultural practices themselves are changing. This includes increasing scientific or technical knowledge about farming practices. This includes ongoing experiments or test cases where we're learning more about different kinds of agriculture and what their effects are. That in either case, we're looking at changes across time. But because the conversation about farming is is varied in different nomenclature. So Martin had already mentioned that organic farming and regenerative farming are different, but the layperson could be really confused about what the difference is. That these differences are something that we need to be really clear about what we mean specifically. And I guess I could go through all of these points, but I'm getting a background message that Rajesh is actually limited on time, and so I should maybe switch the order a bit and let him speak more, and then come back and talk more later. So maybe, Martin, if that's what you think is the better thing for us to do, just for scheduling purposes, I can come back and elaborate some of these points more a little bit later, if that's a better way for us to use everyone's time. So Martin, could you maybe jump back on and facilitate a bit, because it looks like we're changing the order a little bit here mid-flow.
Yeah. So I think yes, that's perfect, Joe. We'll come back to you in just a sec. Rajesh, are you there? Can you hear me? We'll try and fix this in the background. Joe, why don't you carry on with where you were? We'll try and figure out what's going on. We don't want everyone holding up.
I'll just keep rolling. And Rajesh, whenever we get your microphone figured out, just interrupt, or Martin interrupt, and we'll definitely pass the stage over to you. One of the things that I think is a really important option that we have in terms of semantic frames is the relationship, is the way that we conceptualize the human relationship to nature. And this is something that I think is an unequivocal choice for us, and that is that much of the language about agriculture, or really about how humans relate to nature in general in the Western technological tradition, is this idea that humans should have power over nature, like we're in a superior place humans are superior to nature, we need to control it, dominate it, exploit it, extract from it, have power over it. And that any language we use that evokes this particular relationship between humans and nature is profoundly problematic and is not going to help us. And that what's much more important is for us to establish a sense of equality and cooperation, or partnership with nature. So with farming practices, this can be expressed in whether we are bringing in farm equipment that's going to manipulate and shape the soil to do what we want it to do, which is having control over it, or whether we work with the natural processes, the bacteria and the microbial activity in the soil that helps to convert nutrients. We're working with the cover crops that will help to put nutrients back in the soil and limit soil erosion through wind and water. These types of things are examples where human activities are operating in partnership with nature, with a deep understanding of how nature works. So this shift between power over and partner with is one of those very, very important elements that no matter what else we talk about in this space, that we need to be very clear that power over nature and control of nature is problematic, and that partnership with nature is essential, and it's a shift in the power dynamics. And this also leads to another point that I think is really important for us, is that a lot of the environmental discourse in the last few decades has been describing how humans are the problem. That global warming is happening because human behavior, people being bad. Some environmentalists have even gone so far as to say that the world will be a better place after humans go extinct, and that humans are like a virus or a plague upon the earth. That kind of really dystopian and despair-oriented thinking. And in other research we've done, we found that just turns off the vast majority of people. And so if we want to have a conversation that engages the broader public, any kind of humanity-hating frames, anything that says humans are inherently bad, is just not going to resonate with or engage those people. And so this idea of partnering with nature actually provides a positive role for humanity. That humanity we are stewards, we are partners. We're not anti-science here either. We can also show how our knowledge that we have, whether it's through science or through our tried and true wisdom traditions, depending on which cultural context we're talking about, that humanity actually has a positive role in promoting productivity of soils, promoting healthy growth of food, having a positive role to play in feeding our civilization in the 21st century. And so there are lots of ways that we can frame this conversation where the best practices in agriculture are highlighting what good things we as people can do, and that we do it by having partnership with nature rather than seeing ourselves as separate from it and having power over it.
Right, Joe, so let's move on to the recommendations that we had, that we got to for our stuff.
Yeah, and Martin, maybe if we tag team this part of it, because I think that you're going to have plenty of things to say that are just as important and possibly more important than anything I say, and that way we also don't have everyone just listening to me speak the whole time. But just really briefly, I'll start this off by saying that any stories that we tell, one recommendation I would make is that the stories be redemption stories. And a redemption story, for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, a redemption story is any story that has the world go from a place that is less good to a place that is better. And there are different versions of this, like the fall from grace, which is where the world was better in the past, but now it's been made worse, but we're trying to make it better again. Or just the progress narrative, where things were not as good before and then we're making them better. All kinds of redemption story work like this. And the specific idea that seems to be relevant for the solution space around climate change and around agriculture in particular is that we can just do better than we are now. So anytime that someone criticizes Monsanto and the way that Monsanto is harming our land, displacing our farmers, threatening our food supply, or similar kinds of critiques of industrial agriculture, the flip side of what is bad about those practices is the recognition that we actually know how to do things better than that. So if we can tell stories that create a kind of side-by-side comparison of this is industrial agriculture here on this side, and it's got all of these problems, but we know so much now that on this other side there's other options, these ways of doing things that are better, and we could just do a better job. And one of the ways that we can start to unpack this and make it really concrete for people, so it's not abstract, is to be very careful about selecting what the archetypal role is, like what the typical meaning is for a farmer and the role of agriculture. And in industrial agriculture, the principal metaphor is one of agriculture as a factory process. And so the farmer basically becomes a manager of factory processes. They have these big industrial machines, these industrial processes for how they go and prepare the soil, put in their fertilizer, all the things that they do, and they're basically managing it. And one of the shifts we can have is to go from farmer as manager of factory to farmer as gardener. And if the farmer is a gardener, then there are all these ways that we can tell stories about how gardeners form intimate relationships with the soil, how they attract beneficial insects by planting the right crops, how they develop an understanding of the local climate and the local weather. This idea that gardeners are inherently local and have personalized knowledge of the land, and that their job as a gardener is to produce things that are valuable, which could be food or it could be aesthetic, like flower gardens. But in either case, the role of the gardener is both aesthetic, that it's inherently good, it's ethically wholesome, it's about creating things that are beautiful, and that gardeners tend to become master gardeners by learning from their mistakes. And so anyone who's been a gardener or who knows someone who's a gardener will really quickly learn that people become great gardeners by learning things over time. This idea that we're not already doing it the best that it can be, but that we can learn and improve as we go, is an element of what it means to be a gardener. And this goes back to the first point that was on the first slide of telling stories that are dynamic rather than static. That when we talk about industrial agriculture as if this is the best way to do things, that is a static representation of the world. And that if we instead go into stories of how we're continually learning to do things better, then that is a dynamic version of the story.
Yeah.
So Martin, jump on
Yeah,
in.
pick up on that point, Jordan. That's right, and it also takes us to the other point that we made, and the thing about not being about practice so much, but about relationships. So the gardener, at the center of the logic of the metaphor of the gardener, is the one you talked about, which is the relationship with the earth, and that in that logic is the one that we need to promote, and in many respects, this comes down to very simple language choice. When we talk about the garden, we can use words that invoke the idea of gardens. So cycles, planting, crops, rather than more industrial, more mechanical things like yield and input and cost of production and all those sorts of things. It's a much more intimate language that we're looking for here that invokes that personal relationship. Would you say that's right, Joe?
Yeah, and also one of the things that we talked about in a previous discussion that might be worth mentioning here is that all those terms you mentioned, like crop yield, efficiency, optimization, maximizing production, minimizing cost, that there's this interesting interplay between economic language and the factory metaphor for agriculture. So one of the things I think is really important is for us to be conscientious that if we use language of economics to talk about agriculture, that we may inadvertently be evoking this factory metaphor because they become so interwoven in the discourse in the past. So one of the things that is, I would just call it a risk, because the entire conversation about regenerative farming or other solutions for climate change in the context of food production and agriculture, like I just used the word food production. Well, if we use that word, we might actually get into this, we might fall into the trap of using economic or factory-based language, which makes it easy for our discourse to be co-opted. And so that's something that we just want to become sensitized to as campaigners, that there is a language used by the neoliberal agenda that uses factory language, that uses economic language to dehumanize things. And that, like this happens with healthcare, for example, where we dehumanize healthcare by talking about insurance. In a similar way, we dehumanize the relationship with the soil by talking about production processes of industrial agriculture. That these are things that we want to be mindful of, and if we do need to use them in some situations, at least be aware of the consequences.
Yeah, great. That's right. So should we just kind of talk about, if we were trying to construct a narrative, those key features of it? If you put together the redemption story, the idea that this is about bringing back the best and moving through a phase of having made some mistakes into a more positive phase, and that of the gardener, then we get to these three points. And as Joe said earlier, these aren't hard and fast. This is like a work in progress for us. But if we started with the idea that humanity has learnt a lot, that we've done a lot to learn about ourselves and our environment, and so it's a very pro-knowledge story. It's a pro-modernity story. It's not one that goes back, that takes us back to the previous thing. It's not saying traditional is good, modern is bad, which is something that we can often fall in the trap. We can often fall into in these debates, especially because a lot of the people that we work with, especially from an NGO campaigning perspective, are smallholder farmers, and there is currently a very, very powerful story out there that smallholder farmers are smallholder and traditional farmers and pastoralists. That sort of language evokes a backward-looking, like, let's go back to tradition that we've known for a long time. That's powerful in some respects, but it does lead us into this potentially anti-science space, and it is an off-putting thing for many of the audiences we'll be working to. So rather than that, grappling with this idea, that kind of promoting this idea that we've collectively, humanity has gone through a process of incredible progress and learning, and that is what we are riding on here. We are not saying let's just go back to old practice. Very, very important. And then bringing in that intimate language about nature and our role as stewards, as people who have learned to respect nature, to work with nature, and to understand its natural It's natural cycles. So nature will, on its own, naturally circulate nutrients. It'll take carbon, it'll put it up in the air, then it'll put it back down in the soil, and it'll go back up in the air and then back down in the soil. There's a natural rhythm and cycle here, and that's what we've learned about, and that's what we're kind of moving into the phase where we can integrate that knowledge now at a very, very deep level. And the thing we have to do, therefore, in that process, coming back to the point, this has to be about a process and action going on, is we can remove the barriers that we've been putting down as we've been going through this learning. When our learning was at a certain stage, it seemed logical to us to intervene in natural cycles in a certain way by putting down artificial nutrients, nitrogens and phosphorus. But now we know that we can remove those. We've learned beyond that level of knowledge. We've moved beyond that level of knowledge, and we can now integrate ourselves much more with the natural rhythm cycles. And this is a way to feed the world, because I think one of the big blocker, killer arguments that will be labeled against us in any of this thing is, it's like in the energy space where they talk about keeping the lights on. That's a killer argument. It's just such a simple thing for people. It's a fear-based response when people start talking about moving to alternative sources of energy. The energy companies goes, yeah, but we've got to keep the lights on. And people get that instantly, and it's a very, very potent response to most of the green energy debate. In the same way, feed the world is, we can feed the world, we need to feed the world. Growing population interacts with that narrative, and feed the world seems to be an excuse to do almost anything in this space. So we've got to own that idea of that this is a way to feed the world. This is by working with nature, by picking up everything we've learned, by recognizing everything we've learned, we can absolutely feed the world. And that is absolutely, all the research is saying that is absolutely true. We're not making any claims here that are untrue. That is just emphasizing that particular logic.
Yeah, so one thing I'd add to that, Mark.
And
yeah,
yes, go.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that is that just like with the discussion around poverty, there's this interesting choice between thinking about the world through the lens of scarcity or through the lens of abundance. You know, is there enough food to feed the world? Is there enough land to grow the food to feed the world or not? Just like the question, is there enough money to give everyone a comfortable and desirable life? And when we look at the discussion on poverty and we see that 85 individuals have the same aggregated wealth as 3.5 billion, and we ask ourselves, well, is there enough money in the world? The answer is, well, not if it's distributed this way. That the way we're distributing money, there's no way for everyone to be wealthy enough because a tiny group of people have most of the money. And similarly, when we think about agriculture and growing food, there's this question about, it goes two ways. Like, there will be environmental activists who will say the population of humans is too large, and if we dedicate this much land to humans, we'll destroy other species, and it's a kind of scarcity mindset. That it's a legitimate discussion to have, but it can get us into all kinds of traps that keep the conversation from moving forward. But also there's this discussion about, I would call it like, how our kind of temporal awareness, how far backward or forward in time can we think? And when we talk about the green revolution in agriculture, where they figured out how to synthetically produce nitrogen fertilizer and basically using petroleum products to grow food, what they did was they began to dramatically increase crop yields by dramatically reducing, in a very paradoxical way, the productivity of the soil by overusing it and by exposing it to erosion. So in a period of 70 or 80 years, we've dramatically increased food production by destroying the food growing capabilities of the soil. So the long-term consequence is to create imposed scarcity by having a lack of long-term thinking about food production. But if we work in harmony with natural cycles, there's the abundance that comes with the regeneration, the natural regeneration of working with soils in ways that keeps them from being depleted. And similarly, I think that we can have a discussion about the abundance of food production that's available, how much food can we grow, if we're not destroying the productive capabilities of the soil by working with nature to regenerate itself. And so and it's similar in that if we try to get all the productivity out of the soil in a very short window of time, of a few decades, then we deplete the capacity to make it available to others in a way that's structurally similar to there not being enough money in the world because it's all been given to a tiny group of people and hasn't been made available to everyone. And so we can start to have more conversations about these power dynamics and also the political and economic structures that are put in place to keep them where they are. So the critique of the global banking industry and tax haven networks as part of the poverty discourse, we can talk about many of those same structures for how they are undermining our capacity to have ecological harmony and place us at risk of starving people in the future. So those things we can start to weave them into each other, into a common narrative over time.
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put up the final slide. If people want to know more about regenerative farming, there are a couple of really good websites people could look at. So I'm just going to put these up now. There you go.
Doing that. For everyone's, since the technology is not letting us interact now, we encourage you to interact with us outside of Google Hangouts. So reach out to us if any of this is interesting to you and you'd like to talk more. If you think that the way that we're approaching it might be useful to you, or that you'd like to challenge us and push back in other directions, broaden the conversation, we always welcome and encourage a healthy discussion and healthy debate. So please do reach out to us in back channels, and we'll try to make the interaction more effective and more usable in future rounds.
Yeah, exactly. And I would encourage anybody who's been interested in, who's not familiar with it, to look at regenerative farming. It's a very, very interesting area. And as Joe said, please do, like we said on all of these seminars, please do reach out to us. We're really eager and hungry for more debate with people on these things. We try to respond to everything. Yeah, so thanks very much. It's now so it's 45 minutes. I think we'll stop here. So thanks, Joe. Thanks, Rajesh. Although we couldn't hear you. Thank you for everybody for paying attention and bearing with us during this technical glitchy webinar. We will endeavour to be much smoother for our next one. We try to hold these things about once a month, once every 6 weeks. They kind of come up when we think we've got something interesting interesting conversation to share with people. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We will see you again all soon, I hope.